There is something unsettling about the Sumerians. Not unsettling in the way ruins or broken walls are unsettling, but unsettling in a quieter, deeper way, as if their civilization did not begin at the start of a story, but somewhere in the middle of a sentence. Once you notice that feeling, it becomes difficult to ignore, because when we look at Sumer, almost nothing about it behaves like a true beginning. History usually follows a recognizable rhythm: small experiments, gradual progress, mistakes layered beneath improvement. We expect to see rough tools evolve into refined ones, simple systems slowly turning complex over generations. But Sumer does not follow that rhythm. It appears already composed, already organized, already fluent, as if it inherited something rather than invented it. And that alone should make us pause, because Sumer enters the archaeological record around 3500 BCE, and it does not look like a civilization learning how to be one. It looks like a civilization that already knows. Its cities are planned. Its irrigation systems function immediately. Its mathematics is precise. Its writing system is capable of recording law, astronomy, medicine, trade, and myth from the very beginning. This is not how civilizations normally start. Most cultures leave behind a long trail of trial and error, crude attempts buried beneath refined solutions, writing systems struggling to form, symbols changing, simplifying, evolving. But when we look at Sumer, that trail feels strangely absent. It is as if the rehearsal never happened, as if the stage lights came on and the performance was already underway. That is the first sense in which Sumer feels unfinished, not because it failed, but because it feels like the middle of a much longer story, and the Sumerians themselves seem to understand this. When their scribes pressed reed styluses into wet clay, they did not write like people inventing something new. They wrote like people preserving something old. Again and again, in temple inscriptions, legal texts, and royal dedications, a phrase appears in different forms. This is the restoration of what was before, not creation. Restoration. That word matters, because restoration implies loss. It implies damage. It implies that something once existed in a more complete form and was broken, which leads to a question that cannot be avoided. What were they restoring? Before we go further, it's worth saying something clearly. If you're drawn to this kind of history, the kind that does not rush to conclusions, the kind that sits with uncertainty instead of explaining it away, this channel is built for you. So take a moment to subscribe, not because of algorithms, not because of trends, but because this space is dedicated to unfinished histories, lost continuities, and the uncomfortable gaps we usually ignore. If that resonates with you, you're in the right place. Now let's return to Sumer, because the idea of restoration changes how we should read everything they left behind. Take their writing system, for example. Cuneiform appears suddenly already complex. In its earliest known form, it contains hundreds of symbols, not simple pictographs slowly turning abstract, but a hybrid system combining logograms, phonetics, and grammatical markers. This level of sophistication normally takes centuries to develop, yet beneath cuneiform, there is no clear learning phase, no awkward proto-stage, no competing systems trying and failing. It simply appears, as if someone already knew how writing should work. The same pattern appears in their mathematics. The Sumerians used a base 60 numerical system, which we still use today to measure time and angles: 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Base 60 is elegant, but it is not intuitive. Someone chose it deliberately because it is divisible by many numbers, making calculation efficient for trade, engineering, and astronomy. But the Sumerians never describe inventing this system. They describe learning it. Their educational tablets do not say, "We developed this method." They say, "From distant days, the scribal art has been practiced." From distant days, not from them, not from their ancestors, from somewhere further back. Then there are their cities. Uruk, one of the earliest Sumerian cities, covers hundreds of hectares in its earliest major phase. It has defensive walls kilometers long, districts for different types of labor, temples aligned with celestial events. Building something like this requires planning, logistics, mathematics, leadership, and institutional memory. It requires people who already know how to coordinate large populations. Normally, we would expect to see smaller experiments before something like Uruk emerges, villages becoming towns, towns becoming cities. But in southern Mesopotamia, that transition feels compressed, almost skipped, as if the knowledge needed to build cities arrived faster than experience normally allows. This pattern repeats everywhere we look. Writing without a learning curve, mathematics without visible experimentation, architecture without obvious mistakes, law without a long record of gradual refinement. None of this proves that something impossible happened, but it strongly suggests that something is missing, and the Sumerians never tried to hide that fact. Their myths do not celebrate invention. They do not tell stories about discovering civilization from nothing. Instead, they speak of gods who taught, of knowledge that was given, of a time before a great disruption, when the world functioned differently. They divide time into two parts: before the flood, after the flood. Whether we read these stories literally or symbolically, the structure is the same: a rupture, a loss of continuity. And when we read Sumerian texts slowly, without forcing them into modern categories, they do not sound like fantasy, they sound like memory, fragmented, mythologized, but anchored to something real. That is why Sumer feels unfinished. Not because it failed to explain our origins, but because it refuses to sit comfortably at the beginning. It feels like a chapter written after the prologue was erased. And once you see it that way, the question is no longer how civilization began. The question becomes, what was lost before Sumer ever appeared? If the cities of Sumer feel unfinished, their language feels even more so. Because languages are not supposed to appear fully formed. They grow, they mutate, they leave behind ancestors, cousins, and transitional stages. Linguists can usually trace a language the way geologists trace sedimentary layers. Backward through time, sound changes, borrowed words, grammatical shifts. Even when a language dies, it leaves fingerprints behind. Loanwords embedded in newer tongues, structural quirks that do not quite belong. But Sumerian does not behave like that. It appears in writing around 3300 BCE, already mature, already complex, already capable of expressing abstract ideas, legal reasoning, poetic metaphor, and precise technical instruction. And it has no known relatives. None. Linguists call it an isolate, a language with no known family, no clear ancestors, and no descendants. That alone makes it rare. But the timing makes it unsettling, because Sumerian does not emerge early in human history, when we might expect linguistic chaos and experimentation. It emerges late enough that neighboring languages already exist. Semitic languages surrounded Sumer, Akkadian, Assyrian, Babylonian, and yet Sumerian shares almost nothing fundamental with them. Its grammar is agglutinative. Meaning is built by stacking prefixes and suffixes onto root words, like beads on a string. This structure resembles languages spoken thousands of kilometers away, with no clear historical connection, and even those languages have families, ancestors, shared roots. Sumerian stands alone. This should not happen. Languages do not spontaneously generate in isolation. They evolve from earlier tongues spoken by earlier populations. So where is Sumerian's past? One explanation is that its relatives once existed but disappeared. Languages can vanish if the people who speak them vanish, which raises a more difficult question. What would cause an entire language family to disappear without trace, leaving only one survivor? Catastrophe. Sudden collapse. Population loss on a scale large enough to erase cultural continuity. And the Sumerians were very clear about one thing. They believed such a catastrophe had happened. Their texts divide time sharply into two periods, not metaphorically, structurally, before the flood, after the flood. This division appears everywhere, in myths, in king lists, in ritual texts, in cosmology. It is not a poetic flourish, it is a chronological boundary, and archaeology complicates this further. At several Sumerian sites, archaeologists uncovered something unexpected, a thick layer of sterile clay separating earlier occupation from later rebuilding. No tools, no artifacts, no signs of gradual deposition, just clean flood silt. Above it, Sumerian civilization. Below it, something older. At the city of excavations revealed more than 2 meters of flood clay. At first it was assumed to be virgin soil, but when excavators dug deeper, human habitation resumed beneath it. 2 cities, one buried, one built directly on top. The flood was not global. But for the people living between the Tigris and Euphrates, it erased everything they knew: fields, homes, archives, languages. If Sumerian was already spoken before that flood, its isolation begins to make sense. It would be the last surviving branch of a drowned linguistic tree, a fossil language, preserved not because it thrived, but because someone chose to write it down before it vanished. And the Sumerians treated their language exactly like that. Even after Akkadian replaced Sumerian as the spoken language of daily life, Sumerian did not disappear. It became sacred. Scribes continued learning it. Priests continued using it. Kings commissioned inscriptions in it. For over 1,000 years, Sumerian survived as a scholarly and ritual language long after no one spoke it at home. Like Latin in medieval Europe, not a living tongue, but a vessel of inherited knowledge. Babylonian scribes even created bilingual dictionaries, translating Sumerian into Akkadian, so its texts would not be lost. One scribe added a note while copying a Sumerian hymn: "The ancient words must not be altered. They contain wisdom from before the great change." Before the great change. They never explained what that change was. They did not need to. Everyone already knew. This behavior is telling. People do not preserve dead languages unless those languages are connected to something valuable: power, authority, knowledge, or memory. And Sumerian texts consistently frame themselves as preservation, not innovation. They do not say, "We discovered this." They say, "This was handed down." They do not say, "We created." They say, "We restored." The language itself becomes part of the message, a container holding something older than the civilization using it. And that makes Sumer feel unfinished in another sense, because if their language is a remnant, then Sumer itself may be a remnant. Not the beginning of civilization, but what survived its interruption. This reframes how we read their myths. Instead of asking whether the stories are literally true, we ask a different question. What kind of memory would need myth in order to survive? Imagine trying to describe advanced processes without technical language, without scientific concepts, without shared terminology. You would use metaphor, you would use narrative, you would use gods, not because you were primitive, but because language had not yet caught up with experience. The Sumerian creation stories are strange in this way. They are procedural, they describe steps, failures, adjustments. Humans are not created instantly, they are refined. This is unusual for myth. Most creation myths describe perfection from the start. But Sumerian texts read more like documentation filtered through symbolic language, as if someone was trying to preserve how something happened, not why. This does not mean the stories should be taken literally, but it does mean they should not be dismissed casually, because they align with the same pattern we see elsewhere: sudden emergence, inherited knowledge, a language with no ancestors, a civilization that insists it is restoring something lost. All of this points to interruption, to something broken mid-flow, and that sense of interruption lingers, not as proof of any single explanation, but as a reminder that our current explanation may be incomplete, and incompleteness is not weakness, it is honesty. If Sumerian language feels like a survivor, their knowledge feels like an inheritance, because knowledge, like language, usually leaves a trail. We expect to see mistakes, crude versions, early failures buried beneath later success. When archaeologists study the development of civilizations elsewhere, that pattern appears clearly. In Egypt, architecture evolves from simple mud brick structures to massive stone temples. In the Indus Valley, villages experiment with drainage before mastering urban sanitation. In China, metallurgy passes through imperfect alloys before reaching refinement. Progress leaves scars, but Sumer's record is strangely clean. Their mathematics appears fully operational from the start. Clay tablets from scribal schools show students practicing multiplication, division, fractions, and geometric calculations. Not basic counting, advanced operations. One tablet shows an approximation of the square root of 2 accurate to several decimal places. This level of precision would not be formally rediscovered in Europe for thousands of years. This is not beginner mathematics. This is knowledge already organized, formalized, and teachable, which means adults already understood it deeply enough to pass it on. And once again, there is no visible learning curve, no discarded systems, no competing numerical bases, no evidence of trial and error. The sexagesimal system is simply there. embedded across trade, construction, astronomy, and timekeeping. Someone understood its advantages well enough to standardize it across society. Then there is their astronomy. Sumerian tablets record the movements of Venus with extraordinary accuracy. They tracked its appearances and disappearances across long spans of time, noting patterns that only become visible through patient, multi-generational observation. You do not discover planetary cycles by accident. You need consistency, careful record-keeping, institutional memory. The Venus tablets preserved in later Babylonian copies are not speculative texts. They are logs, data, which means the observations they preserve likely began long before the tablets we possess. The same applies to their understanding of eclipses, solstices, and celestial alignments. Ziggurats were not randomly oriented. Their corners align with cardinal directions. Their stairways correspond to solar events. Their placement reflects a working knowledge of how the sky moves relative to the horizon. Again, this is not knowledge that appears suddenly in isolation. It accumulates slowly. Unless it is inherited, Sumerian medicine tells the same story. The earliest medical tablets describe treatments using specific plants, minerals, and preparation methods. These are not ritual incantations disguised as healing. They are practical prescriptions. Willow bark for pain, thyme for infections, fermented substances for digestion. Modern science has confirmed that many of these treatments are effective, which means someone observed cause and effect carefully enough to distinguish what worked from what did not. That requires time and failure. But once again, we do not see the failures. We see reference manuals. We see a tradition mature enough to be taught. The pattern continues in metallurgy. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, Sumerians were producing bronze with remarkably consistent ratios of copper and tin. Too much tin makes bronze brittle. Too little makes it ineffective. Their alloys fall within optimal ranges. This consistency suggests experience, but there is little evidence of experimentation debris. No generations of failed castings, no gradual optimization, just competence. Law follows the same pattern. The earliest Sumerian legal texts show a nuanced understanding of human behavior. They distinguish between intentional and accidental harm. They address property disputes, inheritance, contracts, and compensation. These are not simplistic rules. They assume experience. Legal systems usually evolve through conflict, through cases that reveal gaps and force revision. But Sumerian law appears already aware of those gaps, as if the lawmakers already knew which problems would arise. All of this leads back to the same uncomfortable question: where did the learning happen? If the Sumerians developed this knowledge themselves, where are the traces of development? If they inherited it, from whom? The Sumerians offer an answer, though not one modern readers are comfortable with. They say the knowledge was given by figures they called the Anunnaki. Modern retellings often sensationalize this term, but in the original texts, the Anunnaki are not vague sky beings. They are administrators, teachers, lawgivers. They are described as organizing agriculture, teaching writing, establishing measurement systems, and setting decrees that function more like laws of order than moral commandments. They are not omnipotent. They argue, they debate, they make mistakes. They sound less like abstract gods and more like remembered authorities. Whether these accounts are symbolic or historical matters less than their structure. The Sumerians consistently attribute their sophistication to instruction, not inspiration, instruction. That distinction matters, because instruction implies teachers, and teachers imply continuity, which brings us back to the sense of incompleteness. If Sumer inherited knowledge, then it is not the origin point. It is the archive, a civilization that arrived carrying fragments of something older, something damaged, something partially forgotten. Their texts often express anxiety about loss. They emphasize copying accurately, preserving words exactly, maintaining traditions even when their meaning is unclear. This is not the behavior of innovators. It is the behavior of caretakers, of people who know that what they hold is fragile, that it survived something terrible, and might not survive again. This explains why Sumer feels unfinished, because it behaves like a culture standing at the edge of amnesia, aware that it remembers more than others, but less than those who came before, aware that it is not the beginning, but also not the end, caught in the middle. And perhaps that is why their story still resonates, because we recognize that feeling. We, too, live surrounded by inherited systems we did not create, technologies we use without fully understanding, structures we depend on without knowing how to rebuild. Sumer mirrors us in an unsettling way, not as our origin, but as an earlier moment when humanity stood after a collapse, trying to rebuild meaning from fragments, trying to preserve what mattered, trying to finish a story that had already been broken. If there is one idea that holds the Sumerian worldview together, it is not gods, not kings, and not cities. It is rupture. The Sumerians did not see time as a smooth, continuous line. They saw it as something broken. Their texts return again and again to the same dividing moment, before the flood, after the flood. This division is not metaphorical, it is structural. Their king lists are organized around it. Their myths are shaped by it. Their cosmology is framed by it. Before the flood, kings reigned for impossibly long periods of time, tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reigns shortened dramatically, still exaggerated, but recognizably human. This contrast is often dismissed as myth, but the numbers themselves are precise. They follow mathematical patterns based on Sumerian units of time, multiples of 60, multiples of 3600. This suggests encoding, not imagination. The king list does not read like a fairy tale. It reads like a damaged record, as if scribes were copying information they no longer fully understood, preserving numbers because accuracy mattered, even when meaning had been lost. And then there is the flood itself. For a long time, modern scholars assumed the flood stories were symbolic, exaggerated memories of seasonal river overflow, but archaeology complicated that assumption. At multiple Sumerian sites, excavators discovered thick layers of sterile silt, separating two phases of human occupation. Not gradual accumulation, not seasonal flooding, a single, overwhelming event. At sites like Shuruppak, and Kish, this flood layer appears clearly. Below it, a settled community. Above it, another. No transition, just interruption. Leonard Woolley, excavating the city of initially believed he had reached virgin soil, but when he dug deeper, he found human habitation beneath the flood layer. Two cities, one buried, one built directly on top. The flood was not global, but for the people living between the Tigris and Euphrates, it erased everything they knew: fields, homes, archives, infrastructure, and most importantly, continuity. If a civilization existed before that flood, its physical traces would have been buried, dissolved, or washed away. But memory could survive. Stories told by survivors, skills passed down informally, knowledge preserved through practice rather than writing. And when writing finally appears in Sumer, it does not feel like invention. It feels like capture, as if scribes were racing against forgetting. This explains the urgency in their texts, the insistence on copying accurately, the reverence for ancient words, the emphasis on restoration. They knew something had already been lost once. They feared losing it again. This reframes how we should understand Sumerian civilization. If Sumer was built after a collapse, its sudden sophistication becomes less mysterious. Rebuilding societies often compress development. They reuse existing knowledge rather than rediscover it. They prioritize function over experimentation. They skip the learning curve because someone remembers, even partially. This would explain why Sumer lacks visible developmental debris. The debris belonged to a previous world, buried. The Sumerians were not inventing civilization. They were reassembling it from fragments, from memory, from ritual, from inherited instruction. And they never claimed otherwise. Again and again they tell us the same thing. We restored what was before, not metaphorically, practically. This is why Sumer feels unfinished, because it stands at the edge of two worlds, one erased, one emerging. And when you stand in that place, you are always looking backward and forward at the same time, trying to preserve what you remember, trying to adapt to what you no longer fully understand. That tension runs through everything they left behind. Their myths sound like memory struggling to stay intact. Their numbers sound like calendars stripped of context. Their language sounds like a fossil. Even their gods feel unfinished. They are powerful, but limited, wise but fallible, teachers, not creators. They argue, they regret, they react, they feel like echoes of real authority figures whose stories were elevated as memory faded. When memory fades, meaning changes. What was once instruction becomes worship. What was once leadership becomes divinity. That transition leaves marks we can still see. The flood did not just erase cities, it fractured understanding. And Sumer is what happens when a culture tries to bridge that fracture. Not fully succeeding, not fully failing, just holding on. That is why Sumer does not sit comfortably at the beginning of history. It feels like a chapter written after something was torn out. A civilization aware that it is continuing a story it did not start, and unsure how it will end. This sense of rupture is not unique to Sumer. Flood narratives appear across cultures. Different details, same structure. A catastrophe, survivors, rebuilding. Whether these stories preserve one shared event or many regional disasters matters less than their shared imprint. Humanity remembers rupture, and Sumer may represent one of the earliest attempts to stabilize memory after such a break. That would explain why their civilization feels both advanced and anxious. Advanced in knowledge, anxious in tone. They knew how fragile continuity was. They understood that civilization is not guaranteed. It can collapse completely. And when it does, what survives is not greatness, but fragments. Fragments mistaken later for beginnings. If this is true, then Sumer is not mysterious because it appeared suddenly. It is unsettling because it appeared after something ended, and endings are harder to accept than beginnings. Beginnings feel hopeful. Endings feel unresolved. Sumer carries that unresolved weight. It is not the dawn of civilization. It is the aftermath. And that is why it still troubles us. Because aftermath forces us to confront a possibility we do not like. That history does not always move forward. Sometimes it resets. Sometimes it forgets. And sometimes what we call origins are simply what survived. There is a reason this story refuses to stay in the past. The Sumerians feel unfinished, not only archaeologically but emotionally. When people encounter their history, even casually, even through a late-night documentary or a quiet video meant to help them sleep, the reaction is strangely consistent. It is not just curiosity, it is unease. People describe the same feeling again and again, often without knowing why. They say it feels familiar. They say it feels unsettling. They say it comforts them and disturbs them at the same time. That contradiction matters, because it suggests that something in the Sumerian story resonates beneath conscious reasoning. Not because the details are proven, but because the pattern is recognizable. A lost world, a catastrophe, survivors rebuilding with fragments of knowledge they no longer fully understand. That pattern is not ancient. It is human. Every individual life contains rupture, a before and an after, a childhood that ends, a loss that reshapes everything. A moment when continuity breaks and the world reorganizes around absence. Cultures experience this too, and when they do, they encode the trauma in story, not as analysis, as memory. The Sumerians were not asking, how did civilization begin? They were asking, how do we keep it from disappearing again? That question shaped everything they did. Why preserve clay tablets instead of perishable materials? Why obsess over copying texts word for word? Why treat language as sacred even when it was no longer spoken? Because preservation had failed once. They knew what forgetting cost. This reframes how we should see their civilization, not as triumphant, but as vigilant. Sumer feels less like a beginning and more like a watchtower, standing guard over memory, and that posture changes how we should listen to them. We often approach ancient civilizations searching for origins, the first city, the first writing, the first law. But Sumer is not pointing forward, it is pointing backward, saying quietly, this was already old when we received it. That message is uncomfortable for modern culture. We prefer linear progress. We like to believe knowledge accumulates smoothly. That time itself guarantees improvement. The Sumerians challenge that assumption. They suggest that knowledge can be lost, that civilizations can collapse completely, that rebuilding does not mean advancement, only survival. And survival often looks sophisticated because it borrows. This is why Sumer feels strangely relevant. We live surrounded by systems we did not create and do not fully understand. Electric grids, digital networks, medical infrastructure, global supply chains. We inherit functioning complexity without knowing how to recreate it from nothing. If those systems failed, we would not easily invent them again. We would preserve fragments, manuals, rituals, stories. We would mythologize engineers the way Sumer mythologized teachers, and future generations might look back at us and wonder how our world appeared so suddenly. They would be wrong, but only because continuity had been lost. This is the Sumerian warning, not that gods created humanity, but that memory is fragile, and when memory breaks, history becomes myth. The Sumerians sit at the threshold where memory turns into story, where documentation becomes allegory, where testimony is mistaken for theology. Once that shift happens, recovery becomes almost impossible. You can excavate artifacts, you can translate symbols, but you cannot reconstruct context once the living chain is broken. That is why so many Sumerian texts feel incomplete. They reference institutions we do not recognize, practices no longer explained, titles without clear function. They assume shared understanding that no longer exists. They were not writing for us. They were writing for those who still remembered. That audience is gone, and we are left listening through a broken signal. This also explains why later civilizations treated Sumer with reverence. Babylonians called it ancient even by their standards. Assyrians preserved its language long after it was dead. They sensed depth. They knew Sumer carried something older than itself. And instead of replacing it, they preserved it, as if removing it might collapse the foundation beneath them. That instinct was correct, because civilizations do not rest on stone, they rest on memory. Once memory erodes, structures remain, but meaning dissolves. We still use Sumerian mathematics, but we no longer remember why certain choices were made. We inherited the tools, not the worldview, which leads to a quiet, unsettling thought. What if we are already living in a post-collapse world? Not technologically, but cognitively, surrounded by inherited systems we barely understand, mistaking survival for progress, mistaking continuity for permanence. The Sumerians may not be asking us to look backward. They may be warning us to look forward, because they understood something we are only beginning to relearn, that civilizations do not end with fire or invasion, they end with forgetting. And once forgetting begins, it accelerates. Records become stories, stories become myths, and myths feel unfinished, just like Sumer. That is why their presence lingers, not because they explain our origins, but because they mirror our vulnerability. They remind us that intelligence does not save civilizations, continuity does, and continuity is fragile. Sumer does not offer closure, it offers tension. It leaves us with the sense that something mattered deeply, was partially preserved, and then slipped further out of reach. Not a mystery to be solved, a warning to be understood. And perhaps that is the most honest legacy any civilization can leave. Not answers, not certainty, but a trace, a reminder that what truly survives is not what we build, but what we remember to preserve. At some point, every unfinished story stops asking for answers and begins asking something else. Attention. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that lingers. That is what the Sumerians leave behind. Not a solution, not a revelation, but a feeling that refuses to resolve. They do not explain where everything began. They do not tell us who came first. They do not offer a clear origin. Instead, they leave us standing in the aftermath. And aftermath is uncomfortable because aftermath forces us to accept that something ended before we arrived. That something mattered deeply enough to be remembered, but not deeply enough to survive intact. The Sumerians never present themselves as founders of the world. They act like caretakers, archivists, people who arrived after a break and did their best to hold on to what remained. Their obsession with order was not ambition, it was fear, fear of forgetting again. That fear shaped their cities, their education, their rituals, their gods. It shaped their insistence on copying texts exactly, even when meanings were unclear. It shaped their belief that the past was not something to surpass, but something to stabilize. This is why Sumer does not feel triumphant. It feels careful, like a civilization walking across cracked ground, aware that another collapse is always possible. And that awareness gives their story a strange emotional gravity, because it feels familiar, not historically, existentially. We recognize that posture. We live inside it. We are surrounded by systems we inherited, languages layered with meanings we did not create, technologies we depend on without fully understanding. We assume continuity, because continuity has held so far. But the Sumerians remind us that continuity is not guaranteed. It must be maintained, protected, remembered. And memory, once broken, does not heal cleanly. It fragments, it distorts, it turns into story. This is why Sumerian myths feel different from later religious narratives. They are not confident. They hesitate. They revise. They record failure. They read like people trying to remember how something once worked, rather than inventing why it should exist. Their gods are not perfect creators. They are managers of fragile systems. They debate, they regret, they adjust. That tone only makes sense in a world that has already collapsed once. And once you accept that possibility, everything else falls into place. The sudden sophistication, the missing learning curves, the isolated language, the obsession with restoration. Sumer does not look like a beginning. It looks like recovery, and recovery is never neat. It carries gaps, it carries scars, it carries knowledge without context. That is why their civilization feels unfinished, not because they failed to complete something, but because they were continuing something that had already been broken. We often ask whether the Sumerians knew more than we think. That may be the wrong question. The better question is whether they remembered more. And memory is a strange thing. It does not preserve everything. It preserves what feels essential, what feels dangerous to lose. The Sumerians remembered enough to rebuild cities, enough to calculate time, enough to watch the sky, enough to write laws. But they did not remember enough to explain where it all came from. So they encoded memory in ritual, in myth, in reverence. They protected what they could and accepted that some things were already gone. That acceptance is what gives their legacy its weight. They are not trying to impress us. They are warning us quietly across millennia. They are saying this has happened before. Knowledge can vanish, continuity can break, civilization can reset. And when it does, those who come after will mistake survival for origin. They will think the fragments are the beginning, and they will feel something is missing, even if they cannot explain why. That feeling is not confusion, it is recognition. We sense that something preceded us, something complex, something fragile, and that intuition unsettles us because it suggests the same thing could happen again. The Sumerians do not sit at the start of history. They sit at one of its fault lines, a place where memory fractured and meaning had to be rebuilt from what remained. They remind us that history is not a straight ascent. It is a terrain shaped by collapse and recovery, by forgetting and remembering, by stories that survive even when their origins do not. And perhaps that is why, after all these thousands of years, their presence still lingers. Not because they explain who we are, but because they reveal how easily that knowledge can disappear. They show us what it looks like when a civilization stands after a break and tries to hold the world together with memory alone. That is not ancient, that is human, and maybe that is the final truth beneath the clay tablets. Sumer does not feel unfinished because we lack answers. It feels unfinished because it was never meant to finish the story. It was meant to carry it forward, and now that burden rests with us. What we choose to preserve, what we choose to forget, what we mistake for beginnings, and what we fail to notice until it is already gone. Because unfinished stories do not disappear, they wait. And eventually, someone stands where we once stood and feels the same quiet discomfort, the same sense that something important came before, and the same question that lingers long after the words end: what was lost, and will it happen again?